it's, I was just thinking, I'm both a clinical psychologist and an occupational psychologist, and I don't think I've ever been to any conference other than just those two, which shows you how narrow I am. But nevertheless, today I want to talk about this concept of psychological flexibility, which has really emerged in both clinical psychology in particular, but also beginning in work psychology as well. And what it is doing is it's really reflecting a sea change that's occurring in our understanding of not only mental health, but behavioral effectiveness as well, which we can think of in terms of job performance for what we're doing here. And the interesting thing, it's really driven by research findings from many different areas of psychology, social psychology, cognitive psychology, and of course, clinical and occupational psychology as well. And it's really challenging, I think, one of the sacred cows of clinical psychology from the 60s even to today as well. And that is that thoughts, the content or nature of your thoughts largely determines your psychological health. So if you have the thought, I am a worthless person, you're likely to be depressed. And so the goal of therapy, cognitive behavior therapies, is really to change your thinking from I am a worthless person to say I'm an adequate, normal human being. But what we found is that lots of studies over the past 20 years in particular has shown this isn't the case. That people who recover from, say, depression or obsessive compulsive disorders don't really have their thoughts changed. They react differently, they behave differently, and they react differently to the thinking that they have as well. And so the real nature, goal of these what are called third wave or contextual cognitive behavioral therapies is to change the way that people react to the thoughts, feelings, memories, images, physiological sensations even that they have. And so that is really what I'm going to talk about today. And one of these third wave cognitive behavioral therapies called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, has at its core, at its center, this concept of psychological flexibility, which it's ACT's model of mental health, you might say. And this talks to the people's ability to focus on the current situation in the here and now, and take appropriate action towards achieving their goals and values, even in the presence of unwanted or difficult internal events. And many people, especially in the occupational world, ask me, well, this focus on goals and values, people have been positing that forever. Goal-setting theory, control theory, action resource theory. These have been around forever, and that's true. But what I think is different here is that psychological flexibility is talking about our ability to accomplish our goals, move towards what we value, even in the presence of challenging or unwanted psychological events. And I think that's the key, that yes, can you go forward and do something that you value, even if you're feeling anxious, even if you have self-doubt. And that in and of itself says, well, how do you do that? Because I'm sure all of us have thought, well, I'm not going to do that or have that conversation today, even though I should do, because it just feels too uncomfortable. I know that happens to me all the time. And so what psychological flexibility has at its core is this concept of mindfulness. That is our ability to observe our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions on a moment-to-moment basis, not going into them or elaborating upon them, and treating them in a really non-judgmental way, letting them go, as it were. And we know over years of research that just doing that alone can improve people's mental health. And it also provides a good psychological space to look at the goals and values that we have and how we can further those in any kind of given situation. So psychologically flexible people are less needlessly focused on avoiding or suppressing, really otherwise controlling their internal events. And this gives them more attentional resources to see what is actually going on in the here and now. And thus they're better able to take good decisions as to how to act. And they also have a broader repertoire of decisions or of actions that they can take because they're less likely to be avoided and not have those conversations or have those experiences that they may need in order to further the goals that they have. And so it's really their focus on the present moment, coupled with a willingness to experience whatever they have to experience, self-doubts, anxiety, and then go forward and try to achieve their goal. And so they have more sensitivity because of this mindfulness to be able to respond effectively to a given situation depending upon the goals that they have. And indeed, it's this context sensitivity hypothesis that we believe can suggest why the concept of psychological flexibility may be useful in terms of enhancing, if we enhance this, perhaps we can enhance things like job performance and mental health as well. And that's what we've been trying to study really over the past 12 years or so. And what I'll do is just, ISSID today is just whetting your appetite. Probably one or two of you have heard of psychological flexibility, so I'll just explain it and some of the data that we have behind it. So if you're at all interested one day, you can go and dig deeper into it. But to begin testing whether or not psychological flexibility may be useful or pertinent to the work environment, we conducted a two-wave, I love this, two-wave autoregressive cross-lagged panel design. Don't I sound clever? Basically, we gave, as people probably know, a set of questionnaires and measurements we took at time one, and then 1 year later, we gave the same ones. And we gave these to 800 call center workers, basically, at a UK bank, which yet still exists, actually. And these people had to work for this bank for at least 2 years, which you'll see why, and they had to input data as a primary part of their job. People often ask how we measure psychological flexibility, and we do so over the past 20 years or so through the acceptance and action questionnaire. There can be various versions, but here's one that reflects the work environment. So you can see it says, I'm able to work effectively in spite of any personal worries that I have. I can move towards my goals of working even if I'm concerned. Or my performance would suffer if I had an overly critical boss. If you say, yes, absolutely it would, that means you're kind of lower on psychological flexibility. This is the model that we actually posited. We thought that psychological flexibility, negative affectivity, locus of control, and job control would all predict mental health, performance, and job satisfaction a year later. Job control is used in most every study of occupational health and performance because it is the one variable that consistently, over and over and over, tends to predict things well. So if you're looking at these kinds of outcomes, you need to include job control. And indeed, what we found was basically, thankfully, what we kind of hypothesized. And that is that, in particular for our purposes here today, that psychological flexibility, I can't even say it, predicted psychological health, job satisfaction, and our measure of performance, which was keystroke errors made by the call center operators and that weren't corrected immediately because the government comes in and has a close look at these records each year. So if a bank performs poorly, that bank is in a lot of trouble. So this is a key performance indicator. And what we found is people with higher levels of psychological flexibility performed better, which makes sense to us given that concept of mindfulness and having the attentional resources to be in the present moment and perform as you need to. And we found some other things too, which I won't really bother to go into. But one thing that's interesting to know, it did predict all of these outcomes over and above negative affectivity and locus of control. And we've seen when we put in the big five personality factors, we've seen that same sort of pattern. So it does seem to be measuring something that other measures don't seem to be picking up on. So now that we saw that it was useful in predicting keystroke errors and those small little behaviors, let's look at it in a wider context. And we conducted another study where we looked at the impact that psychological flexibility had in an intervention that tried to increase job control. This we conducted, it was a quasi-experiment that took place in 2 separate call centers of a UK bank, and this one no longer exists. Not because of what we did, I hasten to add. But we had 2 different call centers. One served as the intervention group, and the other served as the control group. And we went in there and we basically gave these call center workers more control over how they did their job. When they could take toilet breaks, when they could go to lunch, just little things like that, but which we thought would be very helpful. We found what we wanted to. Thankfully, mental health improved, lower is better for this score, or for this measure, so that was nice. Absence levels decreased as well in the intervention group, which saved them, I don't have up here, but about £145,000 in costs, just in terms of staff costs, over the year or so of this study. And job control went up, which was good. And one thing that was interesting is we found that the intervention worked because it increased people's perceptions of job control. But what was interesting is the intervention was most useful for those people who had higher levels of psychological flexibility. They perceived when and how they got more job control. And that perception of an increase in job control accounted for the improvement in mental health and absence levels that they experienced. And we found this same kind of pattern of results with different outcomes in other similar quasi-experiments that we conducted. So for example, in one, giving people more control over their work and more supervisor support, again in a call center, led to an increase in sales figures. But it was, you had the highest increase in sales figures amongst those people who were also higher in psychological flexibility. And that same pattern applied to turnover as well. So basically what we're seeing is that on a whole range of different types of outcomes, from small levels of performance in terms of keystroke errors to things like sales figures, we're really seeing an improvement, especially amongst people who have higher levels of flexibility. Luckily, one thing that we've seen as well is I'm not really interested in studying a lot of variables that I can't affect, that I can't influence. And so hopefully we can influence psychological flexibility. Indeed, that is the goal of ACT, which tries to increase it. So we wanted to see if we could do this in the work environment as well. And we've published a number, 5, 6 studies over the past 11 years, basically showing that we can do that in a short amount of time, 9 hours, spread over 3 months in groups. So very cost effective, but it's also led to good improvements in outcomes such as mental health and innovation. And also we've seen in sales figures very recently. And just one thing too, I don't have time to go into this, and indeed, no one here works at an investment bank, do they? So perhaps I shouldn't be showing this right now. But one thing that we have seen is when we train leaders who are going through a transformational leadership program in ACT, we've been able to increase the amount of money that those teams have made as investment traders in investment banks as against a control group to about £17 million more over an 8-month period, which sounds like a lot of money to you and me, perhaps, but to investment banks it's a medium effect size. But nevertheless, I think what this shows once again is that this is a variable that might have some importance in allowing us not only to predict, but influence mental health and job performance in the workplace. Thanks very much. My timekeeper here says that we have a couple of minutes for questions, if there are any.